This is Battleground PA, a PennLive podcast discussing the issues that matter to Pennsylvanians and documenting the events in the Keystone State and beyond that could shape how you vote in the 2024 elections.
Greetings, everyone. This is Joyce Davis. I'm PennLive's Outreach and Opinion Editor. And yes, this is Battleground PA, the weekly podcast on political and social and whatever we feel like talking about here leading up to the 2024 elections. And we have, as usual, Jeffrey Lord, and Jeffrey is looking fit and young as ever, right? We're just talking about
Joyce, wearing F&M's blue and white, just FYI.
Yeah, well, as I told him, he is such a proud graduate of Franklin and Marshall. I'm sure you remind us about that every other show. but he's really proud because we have invited Berwood Yost to join us. And Mr. Yost, I'm going to give him that title for now. He is director of the Center for Opinion Research and the director of the Floyd Institute for Public Policy at Franklin and Marshall College. He's also the director of the Franklin and Marshall College poll, which tracks public attitudes toward public policy issues and political campaigns. And guess what? That's why we asked him to join us here today. Franklin Marshall has a new poll out. It is scintillating. It has got a lot of stuff to talk about in it. But before we do, I just want to give Berwood Yost a chance to say hi to everybody.
Well, hello. Thanks for inviting me. I'm excited to talk with you today about some of our recent polls findings.
Right. Well, good. Well, we're going to jump right in because there really is a lot of ground to cover. And, you know, it's a lot of stuff because we like to talk about local and state as well as political. But let me just throw it open to you, Berwood Yost. When you did this poll, was there anything, or maybe just tell us, what are the top takeaways that you would tell people? If you can't delve into all of it, here's what you need to know.
Well, I guess it depends on what your interests are, because there's a lot of ground that we cover. There's sort of the contextual questions that relate to how people are feeling in their lives, which ultimately may reflect how they want to vote in the election. So we have lots of questions about the election, both the Senate and presidential race. And also, of course, we ask a number of state-related topics as well. So, depending on your interests, there may be lots that you want to look at in this poll. I guess from my perspective, I'm always interested in the contextual stuff. So how many people feel good about their personal finances? What are the problems they're confronting in their lives? What do they think about the direction of the state? And all of those things, when you sort of add them up, suggest that Pennsylvanians are pessimistic, have been pessimistic, but they're fortunes are starting to change a little bit. And if anything, they're more optimistic than they even were probably going back to the pandemic. So still a little bit of pessimism, more pessimistic than optimistic, but the optimism is growing. And I think that's an important part of the data that we want to understand as we think about, voters and the things that matter to them. And obviously, at the top of the list of things that matter to voters right now is the economy. I mean, about a third of voters tell us top of mind, that's the thing that matters most. Although when you ask them what's driving their vote choice, that changes a little bit. So the economy is driving some voters more than others. Abortion rights are important to some voters more than others. Even something like immigration might rise higher in that list of things to care about if you're voting for a candidate than things that might concern you in terms of what's confronting the state. So, that's where I always start. We can talk about other things, but I think that contextual stuff's important to understand.
I think that was very important. And I'm going to tell you, when I was looking over that, I was a little confused because Pennsylvanians aren't exactly optimistic, but they're more optimistic than they used to be. And I found myself scratching my head. Well, what does this mean? Is it just that Pennsylvania Dutch culture that doesn't want to get too excited or appear too happy about anything? I don't know.
Well, it's a fair question. But, Joyce, I think the reality is that the pandemic, prior to the pandemic, many people were feeling positively about the economy, about their own finances. the pandemic came that disrupted our lives. We saw optimism really decline at that point. And then inflation hit. And that inflation, that when we ask people, how they're feeling about their personal finances, if they told us they weren't feeling positively, that they were worse off than they were previously, we asked them why. And at the top of that list was inflation. So I think we had a number of things that really kind of disrupted people's everyday lives. And, perhaps we'll get back to where we were prior to the pandemic. It looks like we're moving that way, but we'll see.
Yeah, we will see. Well, Jeffrey, I know I'm not going to steal away your thunder, because I know you're going to want to ask this question about why should we trust these polls anyway?
Well, you always trust an F&M poll. Always.
Thank you.
Oh, my goodness. Here we go.
I always overlook the business that Dewey is a certain winner, but what can I say? Well, I'm interested in hearing it, and so far what I'm hearing is, if there's anything I learned in my participation in Pennsylvania politics after I got all the academic stuff at F&M with professors like Sid Wise and Dick Shear and Stan Michalak, the legends of the day.
Yes.
One of the things that I began to realize is that Pennsylvania is, in essence, a purple state. There are sections of it that are pretty red. There are sections of it that are pretty blue. And depending on the situation and the election, it can go either way. And it's hard to predict. So we will see. And if I've learned anything in politics, is that something can happen tomorrow morning. Yes. That changes the whole thing. And the example I always use, Joyce has heard me say this, and it was a very sobering one. I was in the 7th grade and went off to school. We lived in Massachusetts at the time. We went off to school, and this was 1963, November, and the polling question of the day was, who would President Kennedy be facing, Barry Goldwater or Nelson Rockefeller? When I got out of school at 2:30 in the afternoon, everybody, it was an unbelievable experience. Everybody you could see was sobbing because they had just found out that President Kennedy had been assassinated, of course. Well, needless to say, that turned the whole election upside down, and it was now Lyndon Johnson, and everything changes. My lesson from that is not that I expect drastic things to happen, but anything can happen. In our more recent lifetime, the pandemic happens.
That's one of the things that when we do talk to pollsters, they tell us this is just a snapshot in time
of a moment. Yeah. That's right.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. I mean, I don't make any claims that we're trying to predict how people might behave. I think what our poll always tries to do is describe things as they are at the moment. Now, there are people who take polls and make predictions based on polls. And, I think that's on them to get those predictions right. I've been thinking about this a lot, and it's almost like in baseball, blaming the bat manufacturer if Bryce Harper hits a home run. Well, it's Bryce wielding the bat, even though somebody else made that bat, right? He's responsible for making that contact. And I think it's very much the same with polls. They're a really useful tool. If they're done well, they can describe how people are feeling. And even when, they miss the final electoral margins, which they'll come close, but many people think that's their only job. The truth is, if you look at the polling, the polls often provide many, many data points that tell you the context of the election and really help you understand what's going on. And I think that's their greatest strength.
Well, I do notice that, tell us again, give us a little bit more context. This poll, which basically on the national scale, let's say if I summed up, it shows a lead for Kamala Harris right now over Trump on most issues, although not on economy. It shows that people are feeling really, really, really good about our governor, that he's apparently really swimming things. But there are still some. I guess one of the questions I ask is, give us the context of when this was done, right? Was this right after the Democratic Convention when people were up here? And also, I did notice that the methodology had you talking to a few more Democrats than you did Republicans. Did that skewer things? So give us some context with that.
Sure. And, we have our methods are fully transparent. We describe how we do our surveys. We provide the full questionnaire that we use. So anyone who's interested can go and read those things for themselves. This particular poll was basically done the first week of August. So Kamala Harris had been a candidate for about a month. And we were distant from the debate and from the assassination attempt and all those sorts of things. So things had mostly settled down. I think the Walz selection happened a bit right before we had gone into the field. And so the poll is a couple of weeks old by this point. And as Jeffrey said, in elections, that's a long time. Lots of things can happen. But if you look at the marginal distribution of some of those key demographics, like you mentioned, Joyce, for instance, partisanship. Yeah, there's a few more registered Democrats than Republicans. But if you look at the state registration numbers, there's about 3 to 4% more registered Democrats in the state than Republicans. And so it captures nicely the registered voter population, I think. You look at the gender balance, the regional balance where people live, it matches up with what you'd expect based on the distribution of those things we know about the state.
Okay. Well, and what do you credit? I mean, if people are feeling a little bit more, let's say they're feeling pessimistic about the economy but they're feeling a little better than they were before, but yet they're thinking things are going in the right direction in Pennsylvania, right? And they like that. How would you analyze all that? What does that mean?
Yeah. Well, I think part of it is that, the optimism is about where they'll be next year, right?
Yeah.
So the number of people who expect that they'll be, better off in the future are about the same. Those numbers are better than they were in previous months. And so, I think the economic indicators are suggesting that for some people, they're feeling a little better about where things may be headed. I mean, there's still more people who say things are off on the wrong track than headed in the right direction. Even though that right direction number is as high as it's been since the pandemic. So, we're just sort of in this muddled place where maybe we're getting over something, moving towards something better. But that'll depend on a lot of things. And, does unemployment rise, for instance? Do interest rates go down? Some of these things are going to, continue to affect what people tell us about their optimism, their pessimism.
One of the things I'd ask, I've never asked or even really thought of this before, but when an election is over, do you sit down with all the polling data that you had and the polls that you took and say, what did I get right? What did I get wrong?
Yes.
How does this work, et cetera?
Yes. We always do that. And in fact, one of the nice things about technology is that we're able to do a lot more sort of in public. I mean, sometimes those discussions would take place, like I would go to an academic conference and talk to other pollsters about those things. And you still might do that, but we also have a platform now where we can write about what we found out, what our polls said was happening and what actually happened, and talk about what went wrong. So after the 2022 election, we've got a pretty detailed description of the numbers that we produced, how they matched up with reality. And actually the polling in 2022, 2018 was all pretty good, provided lots of interesting context, picked the right winners for the most part. But we also then change methodology if we find issues with our polls. And so we might change the way we ask a question, or we might change the order in which we ask questions. We may gather more demographic information. So every cycle is a test of our accuracy in terms of the getting things right, representing the public, and understanding kind of where the polls worked and where they didn't, so we can address that. And so that is something that we do after every election.
Now, in this poll, you did not find any surprises with regard to the most important issues,
No.
either nationally or statewide, did you?
No. I mean, it's basically the economy at the top of the list, and then a bunch of other issues that sort of trail that. And we ask that question, by the way, a little differently. Some people give people a list. Some pollsters give people a list and say, pick from the list. We just say, hey, what's the most important problem facing Pennsylvania today? They can tell us whatever they want. Then we put them into categories. And so that's why things like immigration, which may show up in other polls as being more important, it comes in lower because we don't put that on the list. People can say whatever they want.
Well, that's actually, Jeffrey, you and I have been talking about this. I just don't think immigration is that big of a hot button issue in Pennsylvania. I really don't. Now, I know you disagree, right? But if it didn't show up, it may not be.
Well, I think it can depend too on what's going on at the moment with that particular issue. If suddenly, and I'll give you an example, and I don't know if there's any blowback on this, but I'm sure we've all seen the images of some gang swarming an American apartment building in Aurora, Colorado.
Yeah, so that one, yeah.
And my point is, if something dramatic like that happens over a period of time, one of the things that I think I saw today is that Mexico is busing a lot of their people to the U.S. border, I guess hoping they'll just swarm into the country. I found that very interesting. I don't think that's had time to sink in yet, but if that's the case, wow, that would certainly be an interesting thing. And one of the and Joyce, you probably heard me say this before, but I'll say it again for our guests. Say in 1980, it was interesting to me, and I later went on to work as a political director in the Reagan White House. So I heard this tale a lot. In 1980, various state Republican parties around the country were trying to recruit their candidates to run for the U.S. Senate, and their so-called A-list candidates turned them down and thought, this isn't going to work. I don't want to damage my career, et cetera, et cetera. So they were stuck, as it were, getting their B and C list candidates. Well, lo and behold, in came something they hadn't anticipated, the Reagan landslide. And the next morning after the election, all those B and C candidates were United States senators-elect. And I thought, it's just sort of a wonderful example of how polls can work and how people can be misled sometimes by what they see in the polls and how they think. And it's just always, to me, sort of eternally fascinating, geek that I am.
Well, clearly, I mean, for the average voter like me, right? These polls, I don't trust them, but the truth is these polls are really valuable for campaigns, right?
Oh, sure.
I mean, who's your biggest audience for this?
I can tell you, Joyce, in the Reagan political office, if any of us missed a new poll, we were in trouble. We had to know. We sat down for our morning staff meeting at the god awful hour of, I think it was 7:30, something like that. And the question was always, do we have any new polls? And if they were out there and we didn't report on them, somebody was in trouble.
Look, Joyce, I think polls are really helpful if you use them in the right way. I don't use them. As I said earlier, I don't think they're great as predictive tools, but they really can help you understand what people are thinking at the moment. When you ask people to report on their own circumstances and how they're feeling and what's happening in their lives, they do that, and polls capture that pretty well. Asking people to predict what they're going to do down the line, that's what they're least good at, right? And so I think if we just keep that in mind, that we can find positive uses for polling. And I mean, even back to the original question about immigration. So that doesn't show up when we ask about the most important problem facing the state. But when you ask, okay, what's most important to you in deciding what candidate you're going to support for president? Well, guess what? Immigration's now in the top 4 or 5. And it's among the top 2 if you're a Republican. And women's rights jumps up there, and it becomes, number 2 if you're a Democrat. So, I mean, these issues work in interesting ways. And I think what Jeffrey was saying about, incidents happening that can cause people to think about these issues more, right? That's what campaigns are trying to do. They're trying to raise the salience of these issues so that people actually vote on them.
Right. Well, as you saw it, for a Pennsylvania voter right now, when you were doing this August 1st, what were those top issues for a Pennsylvania voter as they're looking at the national, at whether it's Harris or whether it's Trump?
Yeah, look, it's economic policies. It's things like honesty, character. There's partisanship. I'm voting for Trump because he's a Republican. I'm voting for Harris because she's a Democrat. I mean, people will say partisanship matters, or policies aligned with my partisanship matters. And so, you have to remember there's some candidate characteristics, there's some partisanship and policy issues, and then there's just kind of broader topics like economic policies are at the top of the list, women's rights show up, immigration policies show up, even things like concerns about democratic practices and democracy. So, changing the frame kind of changes what people are thinking about a little bit.
I can tell you an F&M story from when I was there.
Make it short, Jeffrey. Go ahead.
every year of my 4 years, my government professor, Dr. Sid Wise, would make a point of having the freshman government class sit down and listen to the first 15 minutes of the legendary Kennedy-Nixon debate as people heard it on the radio. Then he would stop, rewind the whole thing, and everybody would watch the whole debate on television. And they began to understand that in the day, in real time, Americans who had heard it on radio thought Nixon won. The people who saw it on television thought JFK won, young, handsome, tanned, and all that kind of thing. Right. And my point is now, all these decades later, wow. I mean, we're no longer talking people hunched around black and white TV sets. We're talking social media and Facebook and yada, yada, yada. And I think that plays a real role in what we're seeing unfold.
No doubt about it.
Unfortunately, we're looking at people also with slanting stuff. I mean, having much more power for misinformation and disinformation this day than ever before, I think.
Yes.
It's true. Although I would say, and I would imagine you'd agree with me on this, that sort of dirty politics has always been part of presidential elections, right?
Yes.
I mean, there's always been efforts to try to, smear your opponent, disinformation. I mean, it's part of politics. I think what has changed is how much easier it is to reach large audiences doing that kind of thing.
And not only the authoritative campaigns, but anybody now has an audience of millions perhaps.
I was just going to say, some 15-year-old can wake up in the middle of the night with a brilliant idea, tap it out, and just reach Lord knows how many people. That's right. Millions of people. Well, it is amazing.
And this brings me to a point too about polling, and the reason that we take such great care to explain how we do our polls and to show people the questions we ask and describe everything we do is because there can be brilliant 15-year-olds who wake up in the middle of the night and guess what? They do their own polling because the price of entry is so low, right? And that and there are others like that who may not be honest in the way they're doing their work. And so for anybody who's consuming polling data, I would just say, be careful, look closely at how those methods are done and who's doing the work.
And Berwood, I have to ask you, you were careful to get a diverse group of people, right? You got African American voters, you got Latino voters, you've got
young voters,
children, and all of that stuff, right?
Yes. Yeah, and you can see all of that in the reporting. You can see how diverse. I mean, the sample of registered, our sample looks like Pennsylvania registered voters.
There you go. I have to say, it is fascinating. It is fascinating to be able to get this glimpse in time and what people are thinking about. But I've got to throw one final question at you, and this is the toughest of all. Okay. What about AI, artificial intelligence? I mean, how is that fitting into what you're doing now? I mean, is it easier for you guys because you got this tool there, or you don't use it?
No, I use AI, not necessarily for this research, although I have found, for instance, that remember I described earlier where we have that open-ended question, what's the most important problem facing the state today? Well, typically what we do is we have our coders, people who look at the responses and put them into categories. So I get a pretty sterile, like this is about the economy, this is about abortion, this is about immigration. So I get a list of those things based on the coding. I have been using AI to put those full open-ended responses into the AI and generate themes. And I'm finding it gives me more nuance and more detail. I'm still not reporting that because I'm comparing it to what my human coders are doing. But there's a role for AI in helping us, if we understand what it does well, same as with polling, right? If we understand the strengths it has, and I think that's summarizing large amounts of text, then maybe we can use that advantageously to get more out of our data. That's how I'm approaching it.
It hasn't upended polling, AI hasn't. It's just definitely being used as one tool that can help you better understand what's going on.
For us, yes.
Okay. We said for us. Are other people using AI much? I mean, is it throwing things up elsewhere?
So there are actually people using or proposing simulated respondents using AI. Oh. So you run a whole poll based on simulations of what people might say through an AI interface. So they're pseudo respondents. I don't know what you do with that, and I'm not sure why you'd want it, but there are people talking about it. So.
Wow. Well, I wondered about that. There was one other question I had, in that you indicated that people actually came to F&M for the, but then later it said there was telephone interviews. So did you follow up by phone, or how did that work?
Yes. So what we do is we draw a sample of voters. We mail everybody a postcard, and it gives them lots of information about what we're doing in the poll. And it says, you can do one of three things. You can call us to complete a survey. You can just wait and we'll call you. Or if you're really interested, you can go online and complete the survey at your own leisure online. And so people have the choice to do the poll whichever way is most convenient for them. And we make every effort to reach people multiple times. So we mail them postcards, we call them, we'll email them if we have an email address, we even text them if they're using a cell phone, just to give them every opportunity to participate.
And you don't pay them or anything, right?
We do not pay them at this moment, no. Okay. And these are not panel members. There's a list of about 8.9 million registered Pennsylvania voters. We draw a random sample of a few thousand people from that list and contact those people.
Jeffrey, have you ever participated in the poll? Has anybody ever called you and asked for your opinion?
Yeah, once years ago. It wasn't an F&M poll. It was, one of the, I forget which one, but one of the major league polls. And clearly I was picked by random. I mean, they had no idea who I was.
Mm-hmm.
And, so I answered their questions as honestly as I could. And I thought afterwards, well, that's interesting to be on the receiving end of one of these things.
It is. And
I guess I'll ask you, do you find people more reticent these days to participate, or is it about the same?
No, look, it's harder to reach people because the proliferation of cell phone numbers means there's a lot of potential ways to reach people. People are busy. So it's harder to reach people now, but we're persistent. We keep trying. So, response rates aren't as high as they once were, but we make every effort we can to reach people, give them a chance to participate, and make sure our samples look like the voter pool.
And you don't keep going back to the same folks all the time, right?
No, every sample is a random sample. So I've been doing this for longer than I like to admit. This is probably I think this is my 5th decade. Maybe it's my 6th decade of polling in Pennsylvania. My name, I've been a registered voter all that time. I've never been sampled for one of my own polls. So that just tells you the random process.
And clearly there are, I mean, we've heard from Jeffrey Lord that you guys are the best. We know Franklin and Marshall is, but as you look at the polling, organizations, we know Gallup has this great name, but what would you say are those that you respect as a pollster?
You know what? There are a lot of great people. There are a lot of people doing really good work, and I respect anyone who's trying to do their work publicly, who is fully open about their methods. So the pollsters that I respect are the people that completely describe what they're doing. They don't hide anything. And so, my colleague at Muhlenberg, Chris Borick, I think does terrific work. I think the work at the New York Times is really solid. I think ABC, Fox, many of these organizations who are really making an effort to do good work, they're great. And you know who they are because you can see what they do. And so, that's my criteria. If somebody doesn't tell you how they're doing the work, I ignore them.
Got it. Well, this is really interesting, and we have to ask you. I love Jeffrey has something else. When's the next poll coming out? Have you already started trying to get the next one together?
September 19th, we'll start our interviewing next week. So be on the lookout for that. We actually are also on my newsletter site, fnmpoll.org. We try to release something the first Thursday of every month, and so. This Thursday, we should be releasing something related to our last poll about undecided voters, which is important. So that's probably worth a read. And I also, as a shout out to Jeffrey, he mentioned Sid Wise. Sid Wise literally wrote the book on policy making in Pennsylvania.
Oh, you made it.
I have my copy in the other room.
So one of my goals is perhaps to revise this for the future. Because I think it should have an F&M imprimatur on it. So,
well, he had sort of a New Englandy accent, and our irreverent college kids in the day used to love to quote him by saying, "Did you read it in the New York Times?" If you didn't, you had no idea what you were talking about.
That's funny.
Well, I want to thank Berwood Yost for joining us because everyone's talking about the latest F&M polling and really to get a little bit of context and background for those of us who aren't necessarily polling experts, right? To understand, make sure it's transparent where the information is coming from, how they gathered the information, and take it with a grain of salt, meaning that it's for a snapshot in time. All right. Yes. And not necessarily meant to predict the end of the universe. So
and the thing, Joyce, the thing that I would add is today is September 3rd. Okay, this is it.
Yeah.
We're down to what's the election date? November 6th or 5th?
I think. Yeah.
Whatever. And here we go. This is when it really counts, and everybody needs to be paying attention out there. And so
this is
buckle
it.
in, as I say to people.
You really pay attention to those polls. So get to work, Berwood. We'll be looking for you, okay?
Exactly.
Sounds good. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone. And we'll see you next week right here on Battleground PA. Bye-bye, everyone.